Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen, and today I have a 26 book, 3-month mega wrap up for you. Not sure if anyone noticed or cared, but I have not posted a monthly wrap up since October, which means I have 26 books that I've read that I have not formally talked about on the channel in a wrap up style, I guess. I had some of these books featured like in my best of the year. I've had some authors come on the podcast, all of that stuff, but I want to document everything that I've read, so I have to do a catch-up wrap-up, basically. So first up, I have 1004 by Ben Lerner. This is a metafictional, autofictional, big-brained, smarter-than-me book. Ben Lerner, I think, is a master when it comes to thinking about narrative, about meta structures in his books, about autofiction, blending the line between fiction and reality. And this one follows the narrator after he has achieved some literary success, and he's also been diagnosed with a potentially fatal heart condition. And amidst all that as well, he is thinking about procreating with his friend, platonic friend. It's also set in New York amidst a bunch of different storms and thinking about climate change and like the end of the world as well, kind of blending all of these things into questions of procreation and telling stories and what's the point of making art and trying to document those things all in a single kind of brief book as well. So yeah, it was super smart. I think I prefer his first book, Leaving the Atocha Station, over this one, but I still need to read the final of like the autofictional trilogy, which is the Topeka School, which I plan to read at some point this year. So Kick the Latch by Kathryn Scanlan. This is a magnificent book. I'm actually talking to Kathryn next week. She'll be on the podcast. If you're not aware of my podcast, it's called Reading the Room, in which I have author interviews and also discussions with bookish content creators. And so this Friday, I'm talking about Kick the Latch with Kathryn, and this book is a magnificent, very brief novella that's told in a bunch of vignettes. So Kathryn Scanlan interviewed this woman named Sonia, who she met through her mom. And Sonia grew up in the Midwest, I believe. And Sonia grew up in and around horse training and on the racetrack. And through this interview that Kathryn conducted with her, she sort of adapts the interview into a bunch of very brief vignettes from Sonia's life, from childhood to the present moment, and trying to figure out how to capture poignant or moving or revelatory aspects of her life into a very brief page count. And I think this is the best case that I've read of a book that uses simple sentences, a very brief page count, and also vignettes. So each section or each moment of her life that's documented is only 1 to 3 pages at most. Seeing how much Kathryn can do with so little was just incredible to me. Horses and horse training and living a life on the racetrack, like those aren't topics that I would normally be compelled to read a book about, but this was so moving and unputdownable, and I think about it all the time. So that's Kick the Latch. My Phantoms by Gwendoline Riley. To me, Gwendoline Riley is a master of dialogue and also creating really fraught and devastating and brutal and bleak relationships. Gwendoline Riley is really good at showing the very small or minor moments in a relationship that have such huge impact on you personally. So whether it's something that someone says to another character that's very brief but cutting or mean, how those seemingly trivial moments can become so pivotal for a relationship, and how it kind of becomes more than the sum of its parts by the end of a relationship, whether it be in First Love by her, about a very fraught and toxic and verbally abusive relationship. And then in this book, My Phantoms, this one follows a very fraught mother and daughter relationship, and seeing how these various trespasses committed by the daughter and the mother, how those kind of boil throughout their lives to the end of the story, which I won't spoil, but it was really bleak, really moving, and stayed with me. It's a kind of a gut punch of a novel and really got under my skin in a way that wasn't really apparent while I was reading it. Yeah, if you like fraught family dramas, I highly recommend this one. After Claude by Iris Owens. I did not love this book. It is a New York Review of Books publication, which I usually really like their books. This one came out, I think, in 1974 or 73, and it follows this narrator who is kind of like, in a way, a blueprint for many of the disaster women or unlikable women narrators that we see in a lot of newer popular literary fiction, I would say, a la Ottessa Moshfegh, Melissa Broder, that type of narrator, I would say. This one follows a woman named Harriet after she leaves her boyfriend Claude, who she calls the French rat. And Harriet, I guess, sort of sees herself as leaving Claude, but really he's breaking up with her. The rest of the novel follows Harriet as she sort of spirals, but she is truly the most like objectively unlikable narrator that I've read in a long time, at least. She's very much, she has no filter. The tone of the book is incredibly pessimistic and cynical, and she is just a very odd and sometimes really funny and witty character. But what was really odd about this book is that I was really bored by it at the same time. Like by the halfway point, conceit of the novel and just the point that I was trying to get across about this character and her processing this breakup and being a woman who has a really hard time connecting with people. Like I understood it by that point. And then the second half kind of follows her. She gets involved in this sort of like cult in a way, and it felt really overlong and bloated, and I was bored with it by the end of it. But yeah, I don't know. This one didn't really do it for me, but I appreciated the tone, and the character was one that I will remember, but I think the execution was a little bit lacking for me personally. Next is The New Life by Tom Crewe. He was the first author that I interviewed this year. I think this one has a very good shot of winning, or at least being longlisted and shortlisted for the Booker Prize this year. This one follows two men in the late 1800s in England as they are considering publishing a book that is in defense of homosexuality. At this time, of course, that is a very controversial topic to be writing about and to be advocating for. And so these two men, who for different reasons are wanting to publish this book in defense of homosexuality. And both of them are in relationships that at their core have a forbidden love affair at their center. And so as the book goes along, it kind of switches perspectives between these two men, and we learn more about their sort of fraught relationships. And then later in the book, Oscar Wilde is arrested, and that really makes them question whether they want to proceed with publishing this book. And so this book ends up being a reflection on free speech, of the consequences of trying to seek societal change and what those consequences are, and whether it's better to just enjoy your happiness in quiet and hiding yourself versus trying to be an open advocate for something that you believe in. I think these themes are very prevalent today, and this is a book that I think is incredibly juicy and dramatic and so lush in its like description of this time. I just loved it so much, and I can see this one being definitely a Booker contender this year. And my interview with Tom Crewe was excellent. He's very nice as well, so we don't really get into spoilers at all. So if you're curious about it from what I just said, check out the interview and then check out the book. It's really great. That is The New Life, and then we'll see if I'm right about my Booker prediction. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This was a reread for me. For many years, I said that The Secret History is one of, if not my favorite book. And I will say, I don't think it's my favorite book, but I do love it. It's very much a comfort read for me. And I read this one as a part of the Reading the Room book club with a couple of friends on here. So I had Anna Wallace-Johnson, Pato, Biblio Sophie, and CJ join me for a live discussion of this, which was so fun. And it was really fun to revisit a book that you hold in high regard in your mind and see if you still think well about it, you know? And this one, I definitely really enjoyed it. There were some moments that I didn't really remember. And then upon reread, it was really cool to kind of see how much I did remember or not, and just how the story impacted me. I do think that the conceit of this novel is so brilliant, and using like the campus novel feel and the dark sort of gothic approach to the story I really enjoyed too. Yeah, so definitely still a favorite of mine, but maybe not like my all-time favorite anymore. So probably one that I'll read in like 10 years again to see what I think about it. But yeah, hopefully Donna Tartt has something coming out soon, because it's been pretty dry. I think it's been almost 10 years since The Goldfinch, which is kind of crazy. Okay, next I read My Manservant and Me by Hervé Guibert, maybe? This one is a very brief, I think it's like 60 pages. It's just a quick little novella, or almost even like a short story, following a story about a guy who has a manservant. And I learned a little bit more about this author's real life, and he is an artist who passed away from complications with AIDS. And a lot of his art was grappling with his homosexuality and also this diagnosis and him dealing with that. And so this is very much a metaphor for having or living with this illness. And it's a very bleak and disturbing book about this manservant and the narrator's sort of abuse of the servant. Through it, it's really, as I said, this metaphor of him, the author, dealing with the debilitating consequences of having AIDS at this time. And so it was a really weird little book, very disturbing, and I would like to read more of this author's work. I think it's out from a indie press called Nightboat. So yeah, if you're familiar with this author, let me know, but I did like it. Next, A Minor Chorus by Billy Ray Belcourt, another author that's been on the channel, and this is one of my all-time favorite books. I read it in December last year, and it made its way into my top 5 books of the year. It is so incredible. It follows a queer Indigenous doctoral student who is stepping away from his dissertation to attempt to write a novel. And the novel that you're reading is him on the page thinking about how to craft that novel that he wants to write. And that mental inquiry being the novel itself. And so this book is very much preoccupied with form, with theory, with queerness, with indigeneity, thinking about how to replicate those experiences and those thoughts on the page in a novel form. So this was like a nerdy treat for me, as I've been thinking a lot about stories and narrative and form and why I'm drawn to the novel itself. And I love autofiction, and this has all of it in it. And then I mustered up the courage to ask Billy Ray to come on the podcast, and he did. Just so brilliant. Definitely check out our interview. Billy Ray is incredible, and the book is incredible. I'll be talking about it on my channel for years and years to come. The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I was quite disappointed by. I think it was more so of a me problem, though, going into it with some certain expectations, I guess, knowing it won the Pulitzer, knowing that McCarthy is a huge, prolific American author. I generally knew about the story a bit, it being a father and son, post-apocalyptic, trying to move through that world, trying to retain some faith and trying to survive. It's very much a survival narrative. So my favorite game of all time is The Last of Us, and I feel like I was sort of subconsciously comparing those two stories because they feel very similar to me. Aside from that, though, I think The Road is doing this interesting thing where it's using like vignettes and fragments to tell the story of this father and son, and it's also kind of like poetic and somewhat philosophical in its telling, then also describing the very like trivial, mundane aspects of the survival narrative of them trying to collect things, of them moving through this the wilderness and the outdoors at this time, the scenes of violence and all of that is kind of balancing the sort of macro versus the micro of their story. And for some reason, I couldn't really get in the swing of this book. I was really, again, kind of like bored by it at times. I felt like it had some pacing issues, but I don't know, like I also recognize that this book is really interesting in how it's thinking about faith and resilience and love, balancing those things with the very corporeal, physical aspects of the survival story, but for some reason it just didn't really congeal for me. I don't know if it's because I was comparing it too much to the game that I love so much, I felt very similar, or just had certain expectations that I was applying to it that I probably shouldn't have. I don't know. I want to try another McCarthy though, so maybe it's just one that's not for me. Next, I have Seduced by Story by Peter Brooks, a book that I think fundamentally changed the way that I read and the way that I think about books, which is probably the most like laudatory thing I can say about a book. It is a collection of nonfiction essays thinking about the use and abuse of narrative. And I truly think that if you are a lover of fiction, I think you should read this book. I think it will fundamentally at least make you question a little bit more what you're reading and why you're so drawn to novels, and make you see how narrative is used as a way to persuade and to get the reader to believe certain things about the story that you're telling. Why we as readers are so drawn to character, why we're drawn to stories versus reality, and how we use stories to understand that reality. It also looks at Supreme Court justices and how they use narrative and stories in their opinions to then make you or influence the reader to believe their understanding of the law and how they apply law to certain facts. And so basically what I'm saying with this book is that it really makes you consider how fiction is perceived and how the things that we read and the things that we consume in the media, in the news, how those stories about reality influence what we think about it. Yeah, I underlined the hell out of this book. I was just blown away on every page. It was just such a good, it was a book that I needed at that time because I was thinking a lot about why I'm so compelled to like do author interviews, or why I'm so, I guess, inquisitive about novels as a form, why I like reading stories versus maybe reading more nonfiction generally. But even in nonfiction, how stories can then bleed over into that realm too, and how those can sort of sway our understanding of real things. These are just all questions that I think about a lot with having a booktube channel, and it was like the perfect book to summarize or encapsulate those ideas. So I love that book, one of my favorites of the year last year as well. Daddy's Gone A-Hunting by Penelope Mortimer. This is a mother-daughter story following a mother who is attempting to help her daughter obtain an abortion, I think in the 60s in England, the various complications that has. And the mom, she's really thinking about her marriage and her unhappiness with being a mother and being married, and thinking about the trash men around her and not wanting that for her daughter, and trying to think through how to allow her daughter to have the life that she didn't. Obtaining an abortion is one way for her to hopefully avoid the pitfalls of motherhood at this time, and also the pitfalls of marriage. And so it's very much condemnation of like domesticity of motherhood, of thinking about female autonomy, and kind of wondering through a motherhood lens how to think about that for a child, and then also thinking about reproductive rights. And so it's a very, timely novel as well. And I think it was really interesting reading this now and kind of seeing this sort of historical lens on this and how it's framed in this narrative. I will say that this book is kind of darkly comedic at times and really propulsive in its telling. For the most part, I think there are some points where the pacing's a little off, but yeah, I really enjoyed this, and I love the cover as well. McNally Editions is publishing some really interesting, sort of lost in the archives, older fiction that's being republished today, and I really like what they're doing with that imprint. So if an Egyptian cannot speak English, this is a formally inventive debut novel that I really liked. It was really big-brained as hell, and I think some of it might have flew over my head a little bit potentially. I would like to reread this one, I guess is what I'm saying. It follows an Egyptian-American woman who is going to Cairo. She's never been to Egypt before, but she wants to go to sort of understand her parents, thinking about her heritage and teaching English in Cairo. And when she's there, she meets a man who lives there. He is unemployed and he's addicted to cocaine, and they end up falling in love. But what this book is doing, it's sort of like a dark romantic drama, but what it's doing is on a formal level, it's told in 3 parts. It jumps back and forth between perspectives of the woman and the man, and it's not really told to you who is speaking to start, but you kind of get into the flow of understanding who is telling a story at certain times whenever it changes perspectives every few pages. And with the audiobook, it's really apparent as well because there's 2 narrators, which helps. But each vignette or each passage is framed by a question to start. So it'll ask a question that's sort of like a riddle or a joke, and then kind of go into the thematic ties to that joke within that section, which is really interesting. But then the 3rd part, which really made this book, like, it blew my mind, really. I don't really want to get into it too much, but it really questions the story that was just told to you. So as I mentioned before, I love novels that really question the form and question what they're doing in terms of storytelling just on the page to the reader. And this book absolutely makes you reconsider what you just read by the end of it. And I love books that do that. For example, I love Trust by Hernan Diaz, which is another one. Yeah, really trying to think through narrative voice and thinking through who's telling certain stories and how that manipulates a reader's understanding was really interesting. Lesson Zero by Bret Easton Ellis. I am currently reading The Shards by him. I just picked it up this morning, actually, and I read Lesson Zero as I knew I wanted to read this book this year. And this book is incredibly dark, more so than I even expected. I had never read Ellis before, not even American Psycho. And there's a certain coldness and like bluntness to the telling of the story of who's on Christmas break and he's returning to Los Angeles from college. And it basically just follows the debauchery, wild adventures, but it's probably not the best word. I guess activities that he pursues during this time, during this break, and the sort of kind of blunt and cold and removed and detached, gluttonous characters that are occupying Los Angeles in the early 1980s. And the narrator really considering, or not really considering, just experiencing that kind of hollowness or the artificiality of LA in this time. Through that, there's a lot of violence that's very bluntly depicted on the page that I was like taken aback by when I was reading it. I do think this book is really stylistically interesting and was really odd to read. If you can tell how I'm trying to talk about this book, it's a weird one for me to summarize because it is so detached and removed that I didn't really know what to make of it while I was reading it. But then I read a piece by Ottessa Moshfegh after, who I think she wrote the introduction to the book like in a later edition, and reading that piece really helped me understand what Bret Easton Ellis is doing stylistically with this book. He wrote it when I think he was in his early 20s or as a teenager, I think shortly after this time for him in real life. I think when he was like 18, he started it or something. But yeah, it's a weird one, and I'm curious to see how in The Shards, how he's going to explore a similar time and setting in a different way. So full thoughts to come. And also I should say, The Shards is my March Reading the Room book club pick. So I'll be having a live stream with my friends Tartt and Jason. I'll link their Instagrams below as well. We're doing a live stream probably the weekend of like March 28th, I believe. Yeah, we're going to dive into this one. It's a quite meaty book, so I'm announcing it quite early if you want to join us. Full thoughts on The Shards to come and a comparison during that discussion as well. So we'll see. Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. This is a book that I've seen on BookTube, on Bookstagram for a long time now, and I've been wanting to check it out. I've never read Convenience Store Woman, and this one is a gross one. I will say, I was kind of warned that this one's it takes a turn, things go left, and that is very true. But it was really fun and interesting and surprising and quick. If I was a young girl who uses fantasy and her belief of herself being an alien to sort of understand why she feels so different from people around her, then, so we learn about her as a young child, and then the later narrative follows her as an adult, and she's married and appears to be like in an asexual relationship with this man. And they kind of just have a marriage of convenience of sorts. And then she ends up being compelled to go back to her family home, and things go left, basically. I don't want to... This book is best if you go into it blind, I think. This book is very much considering trauma, abuse, and how those are understood in this very singular narrative voice of this character was really interesting, but it will get under your skin. Some body horror going on. Yeah, I don't know. If you're looking for a weird, disturbing book, just pick this up, read it, and let me know what you think. Foster by Claire Keegan. This one is a quick little novella. Claire Keegan is a really good writer in the short form that usually has like a really strong emotional pull in her story. So this one follows a young girl who is staying for, I think, like a weekend at this family's house. We learn more about this family and why the daughter has been brought there. It's kind of all a mystery, so I don't want to spoil it at all, but it's really considering family and loss and grief. It was really poignant, and as a quick, single sitting read, if you want something that is sort of like a classic short story feel with like a family drama at its core. Yeah, it was good. Claire Keegan's a really good short story writer that I'm intrigued to pick up more from for sure. How Should a Person Be by Sheila Heti. Heti is one of my favorite writers of all time. This is a book that I think really catapulted Sheila Heti into the writer that she is today. But this one is a novel that really is looking at the choices that we make in our lives and a narrator really considering what does it mean to be a person? How do we choose what to do with our lives, whether it's professionally, whether it's in terms of love, relationships. These are all philosophical questions that Sheila Heti always poses in her fiction. And this one was very direct in its consideration of how to be as a human and those kind of esoteric and philosophical questions that kind of come in to being a human. She explores these in all of her books, but this one was very much, I can see it being kind of the foundation for her later books, Motherhood and Pure Color. I love her books in terms of their ideas about their characters on the sentence level. I love the way that she thinks about the world and makes me reconsider what it means to be here in life, and how she does that through fiction is just really revelatory and big-brained and just genius. So love Sheila Heti. Can't go wrong with any of her books. Closer by Dennis Cooper. This one was a big disappointment for me. The Sluts by Dennis Cooper was one of my favorite books of last year, was my favorite book of the year, I should say. I thought that was like a meta-narrative, metafictional genius story that's very depraved. And this one similarly is depraved, looking at various characters as they are using a certain young boy named George for their own sexual or personal goals or exploits, and how George suffers from that. But I will say this book, in its depravity and its bleakness, ended up feeling quite hollow to me and just very, very weird. And I couldn't really get my finger on what was going on with the story or what it was trying to say about these things. Whereas with The Sluts, I felt like it was really much looking at the internet and gossip and rumors and storytelling. But this one felt more so just so cold. And I couldn't really see what he was trying to do with that, except for looking at coldness in its face, which I think has its own merits. But aside from that, I was just bored by it, just very confused by it, especially coming from The Slut. So I want to read another of his. I will keep reading him. I think he's really interesting and one of the most singular writers that I've ever experienced in terms of knowing when you pick up one of his books, like you can tell it's Dennis Cooper. And I think that's something that's really commendable for any writer. Yeah, Closer did not do it for me. Really interesting. And then now getting into January, Acting Class by Nick Dornasso. This was the first book I read this year, and it was a graphic novel, and I loved it. It is looking at a group of 10 strangers going to this improv acting class, which is being led by this really weird, sort of culty, mysterious guy who is hosting these classes for them. And what it is him giving them different prompts to attempt to act and to improv and to embody a different reality. And so when these strangers start occupying these characters, the actual depictions and the images in the book become that story. So it sort of shifts from them being like in just an empty room to them being in a different setting, and it sort of blends the line between reality and fiction and really showing you that literally through the graphic novel form, which I really liked. But by the end of the book, you realize that these characters who are all lonely and depressed and longing in their own ways, how they start to lose their grip on reality because of this class, and how that spirals further out of control. So good, so brilliant, so dark, and like subtly disturbing. I wasn't really expecting where this novel went, and it got under my skin significantly. So that is Acting Class. Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. This was a disappointment for me. Follows a romance between a young Catholic school teacher and a Protestant lawyer during the Troubles in Ireland. Thought the plot was very poorly paced and the characterization was really lacking for me. The story is doing so much in terms of looking at the Troubles, about looking at what it means to live like in wartime and how romance can sort of fail under that, how familial relationships can fail under that, and just being your own person and trying to seek more for yourself, how that can be sort of destroyed by this time. However, the lack of like interiority or reflection on the narrative, it kind of just becomes a purely plotty book without any sort of emotional stakes that are presented. So like when a lot of the sad, objectively sad things that were happening in the book came, like I cared, but I didn't really care. Like it didn't make me cry. It didn't make me feel particularly devastated. It was just kind of like cold on the page, which was really odd to me because this one has a lot of rave reviews and it's been doing pretty well, it seems like. But for me, I just did not enjoy my time with it, unfortunately. Happening by Annie Ernaux. I love this book. It follows Annie Ernaux when she was younger, attempting to obtain an abortion in France. So this one and Daddy's Gone Hunting are very similar in terms of their stories. But this one I loved particularly for how Annie Ernaux is thinking about memory. And so on the page, she's documenting this time in her life when she was younger, but she's writing it from a perspective of her thinking back on this time and on the page sort of reconciling with the fact that she can't fully remember or replicate exactly what happened. So sometimes she kind of jumps in and she starts saying like, well, here I don't remember exactly what happened, but this is what I think I felt or how I think about it now. And that sort of meta style of her writing, of her attempting to bridge those gaps in memory versus reality in the present moment as a writer is so interesting. I think she's very singular on that front, writing from her own past and her memories, but doing it in a way that is considering why she's doing that and how to do that in a way that's faithful to the past. And then when it's not faithful to the past or can't be because of a lack of memory, how writing is able to fill that for her. I have a goal of trying to read all of her books this year. I have her collection. You can't really see it, but I bought all of her books for myself for Christmas. It was a Christmas present for myself, and I want to challenge myself to read one of her books a month. So we'll see if that happens, but I think she is magnificent. She just won the Nobel Prize in Literature, which I see why, for sure. It was a brilliant book. Fuckboy by Sean Thor Conroe. This is an autofictional piece that I loved because it follows a podcaster who loves Sheila Heti, which we love. I've seen a lot of, takedowns of this book when it came out last year. A lot of controversy around this book. It follows this very clipped and blunt evocation of a fuckboy voice on the page. And why I like this book is that it really leans into that voice with, I don't know, it feels very earnest and honest in its telling, and Sean Thor Conroe really embodying that voice on the page and using it to maximize what it means to be that caricature, I guess, of a fuckboy. But then through the fuckboy's plight and desire to write a novel, he's thinking about what that means to evoke that voice on the page of thinking through what a novel means, him loving Sheila Heti and being a podcaster and seeking conversation and understanding about life and philosophy through different forms. The narrative then becomes him trying to write the book that you're reading, which is a trend in this collection, I would say, but I think it does it in a way that I've never really read before, and I really think that some of the takes that I've seen in this book are kind of unfair to what this book is trying to do aesthetically and from a formal level. I think is really interesting. So yeah, I think Fuckboy got a little bit too much negative press when it came out, and I think it's good. So if you agree with me, let me know. Audition by Ryu Murakami. This is a thriller-y novel that I did on audio, and I really liked it. I'd never seen the movie, but I'd heard about how the ending is incredibly gory and gross and terrifying and shocking. I think the movie is a pretty faithful adaptation of the book, and so it's a really quick little read about exploitation, about commodification, and a guy who's recently lost his wife attempting to hold an audition for a movie, but really it is him trying to hold an audition for his next wife, and how he ends up picking the wrong woman to fill that role, and how that goes left. Severely. Couplets by Maggie Milner. This is my favorite book that I've read so far this year. A new all-time favorite, a book that I cannot stop thinking about. I just had her on the podcast, which came out last week. So it's a non-spoiler discussion. I highly recommend you check it out if you want to read this book. And it's perfect for Valentine's Day as well. It's so good. It follows a woman who is with a man. She is a poet. She's living in New York. And she ends up having fantasies about being with women. And she ends up meeting a woman who she falls in love with and has an affair with. And the story is her thinking about this love affair, thinking about her sexuality, about her desire for herself, about being a poet, And it ends up sort of transcending itself in how it looks at literary form and relationships as a form, and using both poems and prose in a mixed style that kind of jumps back and forth to tell the story of her discovering herself through this love. And she uses the couplet as a form in the poem, which is really just gorgeous to read, and using rhyming couplets was just so, like, it tickled something in my brain, which I had never really read before. It was so nice and invigorating and interesting, and how she's thinking about theory and criticism and queerness and putting it all in a blender on the page. It was just so genius, and I just love it so much. So please, if you like my recommendations, I implore you to check out Couplet. It is so good. Next up, Biography of X. This is probably my second favorite book of the year so far. It's by Kathryn Lacey, who is one of my favorite writers, confirmed. The book follows a widow named C.M. Luca as she is trying to write a corrective biography of X, who is her deceased wife, who is this sort of chameleonic, odd woman. And so the book is at once CM's sort of grief and her processing the loss of her wife, but also looking at X and the sort of mysterious past of hers. And what this book is doing is it's giving this biography, but it's also picturing a fictional present for the US in which the South, after World War II, seceded from the US and became its own sort of authoritarian theocracy, and thinking about what the past would look like if that had actually happened, if the South had seceded, giving an alternate US history that is incredibly harrowing and very weird to think about, considering, you know, current political climates as well. So yeah, it kind of blends this idea of a biography of a woman who was very elusive and strange, while also giving you an alternate US history, but then also the biography incorporates many fictional sources from real people in real life. So, for example, there's a Richard Cusk instead of a Rachel Cusk. There is David Bowie makes an appearance, Susan Sontag, Renata Adler. All of these become sources for CM's biography of X in this very interesting blend of like fiction versus reality, and also a really interesting depiction of grief on the page as well. That book is so hard to summarize, but it is incredible. It's quite long and different for Kathryn Lacey, but I think she's also really exploring her core themes of love, identity, and religion, and doing it in a way that she hasn't really done before. And I think it was really rewarding and interesting, and her best book yet. So that is that one. We also recorded a podcast coming out on Pub Day, March 21st, so keep an eye out for that. Okay, next I have a story collection, The Disappeared by Andrew Porter. This one is a collection of stories all about longing and loss and family, set in and around San Antonio, Texas. Each of these stories is truly like perfect in my mind. Everything that I want a short story to do in terms of raising interpersonal stakes is present here, and it's just so gorgeous in how he renders very fraught relationships and family and personal desire through the story form was so good. I love this collection. He's also coming on the podcast. Highly recommend it if you like short stories. It's a must read. And then the last book that I read in January was Betty by Tiffany McDaniel, which follows Tiffany McDaniel writing the story of her mother, doing it in a fictional form. This is one of the most brutal, sad books that I've ever read in my life. It was so hard to read at times, but so good. Her new book, On the Savage Side, comes out this month on Tuesday, so on Valentine's Day, and I can't wait to read that because she's also coming on the podcast. And if you're looking for a tearjerker family saga about a Cherokee family growing up in Ohio and seeing their plights rendered on the page, it was so poetic and lyrical and just lush in its characterization and just such a really propulsive read as well. It's almost like 500 pages, but it really flew by for me on audio. I highly recommend it. So anyways, that was my 26 book massive wrap up. I'm going to hope to never do that again because I want to, give you timely wrap ups, but also not wait forever to have to do one of these videos, But I hope you liked it. I hope you find something here that you pick up and enjoy. If you've read any of these, please let me know your thoughts on them. I'd love to talk to you about them in the comments, and let me know what your best book of January or 2023 so far has been. I'm very curious to know. Anyways, I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye.